So, since I'm an English teacher, I get to quote great literature when I give presentations, and I want to start with this quote. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was an age of wisdom, it was an age of foolishness. And I really think that if Dickens were alive today, in many ways, he would be happy to write that about the state of education in many places around the world right now. I don't think there's any doubt that this is a moment of huge, huge amazement when it comes to the ways in which we can begin to learn and connect with one another and really do things in ways that we weren't able to do even 10 years ago in terms of building an education for ourselves and developing all sorts of opportunities for our kids to learn with technologies and specifically with the web. But I also think it is an age of foolishness and a very difficult moment as well because of the ways that we are trying to lead a conversation around reform in schools that is very narrowly based, in many cases, on a very discrete set of assessments, and to use some of those assessments in ways that they were never really intended to be used. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit about why this shift that we're experiencing right now is so very important for us to understand, and how each one of us can play a role in leading a different conversation about schools and about education that I think is more meaningful for our kids and for my kids. As a parent, I can't separate my parent lens from this conversation, and I think about the opportunities that my children have, and how those opportunities to learn right now, frankly, look very different inside of school from the ways that they look outside of school. And that's a conversation that we have to begin having in earnest, and it has to be led, I think, by educators. We've gone from a world of scarcity, basically, when it comes to our ability to access information and knowledge and people and content and tools and technologies and apps and whatever else, in 10 or 15 years to a world of abundance, where all of that stuff is at our fingertips in ways that I don't think any of us really even could have imagined 20 years ago. You know, I like to say we weren't talking about this big shift, were we, about 20 years ago? And I don't think we'll be talking about it so much 20 years from now. I think hopefully we will have figured it out in some way, what all this means. But now, right now, we're in the midst of it. We're in the middle of it. And it really is, I think, in many ways transformative. And it's challenging our basic assumptions around what the roles of schools are, what the role of education is, and how we define an education in schools. You look outside of education and you can see how this abundance is changing institutions all over the place. Ask any journalist that you might know if it's different being a reporter today than it was even 5 or 10 years ago. And it absolutely is. Newspapers are trying to figure out how do we build a model in a world of abundance that allows us to compete when everyone is a journalist. You all have phones. If I fall off this stage, you could take a picture and tweet it out right away. And you could report on that event in ways that even 10, 15 years ago would have been difficult to do. You look at media, look at music. One of my favorite stories from this year is right before Christmas last year, my daughter and I were in our basement digging through boxes trying to find some ornaments, and we came across a box of record albums. Anyone remember record albums? And she'd seen them before. It wasn't like, you know, she was looking at it, are these Frisbees? She didn't say that. But she basically, we were talking about it, and at one point she looked at me, she goes, Dad, did you really buy 12 songs to get the one song that you wanted to listen to? Is that really what you did? And I said, yes, Tess, actually. You know, her life is Rhapsody or Spotify. Her life is being able to punch a couple of buttons on a phone and then listen to the one song that she wants to hear when she wants to hear it. And it's a much different reality for her. She lives in a world of abundance. She lives in a world where she has access to so many different things that I never did when I was growing up. And I do want to say, there are a lot of people who don't have that access. And there are a lot of people who have limited access. And in my view, that is something that's almost a moral imperative these days. How can kids who have no access to basically the sum of human knowledge and the vast number of teachers online, how can they compete with those kids who do have regular access to that? And it's a very, very difficult problem that I think we have to bridge at this point. You look outside of education and you can see that change really happening. But you look inside of education and it becomes really difficult to see the shifts that are occurring in any meaningful way. We are not responding as a system, and I think systems around the world, not just in the United States or here in Australia, but I think we're not responding to this abundance in ways that leverage the access that we have for the learning of our kids. I think we are responding to it by trying to take the system that we've had for a long, long time and simply make it better. Whereas I would submit to you that this shift, which by the way is not optional, this shift is going to have to make us different, and we are going to have to think fundamentally differently about the way we do things in schools and the way that we go about the learning business that we're in. I think there are 5 realities we have to face that make this shift acute right now and that make this conversation really important for us to have. The first is that content is everywhere. You know, you realize school is the only place that my kids cannot take the technology that they carry around in their pockets and in their backpacks and answer the questions that they're being asked. It's the only place. I look at the paperwork and the tests that they bring home from school, and I look at those questions, and most of them, basically, I could take out my phone and answer. And I would submit, if we're asking questions in school that can be answered by Google searches, why wouldn't we let kids take out their technology to answer those things? That is exactly how they're going to answer those questions in their real lives. So schools have not caught up to this idea that knowledge is everywhere. We still think kids have to carry it around in their heads. And I'm not saying we get rid of all content, and I'm not saying we get rid of all curriculum, but in this world of abundance, we have to think about that differently, don't we? We have to make some decisions about the skills and the literacies that kids need to find their own knowledge and find their own information if they have access to it. So content and knowledge is everywhere. Teachers are everywhere. I remember back in 2002, in the dark ages of blogging, I was blogging with my kids in school. We were reading a book called The Secret Life of Bees by Sue Monk Kidd. It was a great book. And my kids had their own blog, and they were asking questions, and they were having conversations on the blog, and it was really, I think, it was interesting to watch, and they were going deeply into the conversation. But the best part of that blog was that Sue Monk Kidd was in that blog, blogging with them. The author of that book was participating in their discussions on that space. And she knew a little bit more about that book than I did, if you can imagine it. And she gave my kids more insight than I ever could. And that is the reality of my kids' lives. The teachers, maybe even the best teachers in their lives, don't necessarily be the ones in their face-to-face worlds anymore. And that's not a slight against the people who are in my kids' classrooms, who care about them and who want them to learn. But it is the reality at this moment that if my kids have access, they have access to teachers all over the place. So we have to come to grips with that. What does that mean for what we do in classrooms when there are experts and people who share passions and interests at a greater level than maybe we do, that we can connect our kids to? Data is everywhere. Basically, you know, Google knows more about you than your family does, probably, if you use Google. It's collecting data left and right. Lots of different technologies collect data, and now in education, we are collecting lots and lots of data about our kids, aren't we? We're finding ways to use technology to personalize education, I think, in some profound ways. And that can be good and it can be bad. If the goal of education is to get kids to pass a particular assessment that is fairly narrow in scope, then I'm pretty much convinced that in the near term, there are going to be technologies that will deliver a curriculum to our students in more personalized ways than we are ever able to, that will get them to pass that test better than we can. And if we don't respond to that, and if we don't start having conversations around what changes in schools, then, right, how is that going to play out? How are we going to maintain our value? That's a huge question we have to ask. Fourth reality is networks are the new classrooms. My son, in January, on a snowy January Saturday morning, was driving me nuts. He was dribbling his basketball around in the house. He was torturing the dog, and at one point I just said, all right, Tuck, I think it's time for you to start playing Minecraft on the computer. He had been begging and asking over and over, Dad, can I get a Minecraft account? Dad, can I play? And finally I broke down and I said, all right, let's do it, let's set it up. So I purchased the software for him, I downloaded it to the computer, and if you don't know what Minecraft is, it's a really interesting kind of gaming environment. It's collaborative. It looks like Legoland almost, but it's very cool. You can build things, you can do all sorts of stuff. But I got him started, and I said to him, Tuck, you know, I got to run out. I'll be back in a couple of hours. Why don't you just get started, see if you can figure out how to get going in here, and when I come back, we'll roll up our sleeves, we'll really dig into it, and we'll really, you know, begin to figure out how to do this. Well, you know what happened, right? When I came back 2 hours later, he was making a roller coaster. He had built a whole house. And on the computer on my desk, it was really interesting. He had like a Uvu hangout going on with 5 of his friends who were all playing with him in that same Minecraft server, showing him how to build the things that he needed to build. And he had my laptop on the desk also looking at YouTube videos that had shown him how to start to create all this stuff. He wasn't waiting for me to come back to begin to learn the thing that he wanted to learn. Now, I try to imagine how school would have taught him Minecraft. Here's the book on Minecraft Talk. We're going to read chapter 1 today. Please make a tree tonight that we can all come in and see and compare. And you know I'm being a little bit facetious, but you get the idea. Kids aren't waiting for us to deliver a curriculum to them any longer. You know, I like to say, if you ever see a 4-year-old get an iPad, the first words out of that child's mouth are not, "This is great, when's the workshop?" Whereas with adults, it's, "Can someone show me how to do this?" Kids just start tapping the icons and start trying to manipulate the technology. So look, networks and our ability to connect to other people to learn on our own, that's a powerful new change that education really hasn't attended to very much. And the fifth reality is, look, we can do this anywhere now. We can do this on our mobile phones. We can do it many of you are probably tweeting right now and sharing information. You don't have to be in a classroom. You don't have to be somewhere to learn something. Now, I think this all begs a very, very difficult question for us. And this is a hard question to even say, if you want the truth. But it is this question: what is the value of school at a moment when we don't really need school to do school? We don't really need school to do school if we define school in a traditional sense. I don't need to send my kids to school to learn Spanish. I don't need to send my kids to school to learn algebra. That doesn't mean that I don't want them to go there. I do. I absolutely want schools in my kids' lives. I want them to be in classrooms with other learners. I want them to be with adults who care about them and who want the best for them. That is the best part of school. But if the value of school is that it's the place where kids go to pass a particular narrow assessment in a world of abundance, we have a big problem on our hands. We have to start thinking differently about what school is. There's a great quote that I read by a guy by the name of Justin Wright, who's a teacher at Harvard. And he said, you know, the problem right now is that we're paying so much attention to the measurable part of learning that we risk neglecting the immeasurable part of learning. And it's that immeasurable part that right now, in a world where we have access to so much stuff, it's that immeasurable stuff, that hard to measure stuff, that's much more important. It's that creativity, that gritty problem solving, that perseverant disposition that we have toward learning. All that stuff that's really hard to measure, that's the stuff our children need right now to succeed when they have access to all this stuff, right? It's not that very easily measurable stuff. And so that's a huge problem. And that is the big question that we have to be talking about, I think, as educators, and as community members, and as parents. We all have an investment in this. And this is the moment, right now. It's right now. Because in my country, and from what I've heard, in some measure over here as well, the people who are making the decisions and leading the conversation around reform are businessmen and politicians who may be good people and have kids' best interest at heart, but who are not educators. They are not educators. They are not people who see learning in the ways that we see it. And our voices need to be heard in this conversation, and they need to be heard now. We can't wait. So I'm going to suggest a few pathways to getting into that conversation. The first is, we need to get up to speed on what's happening in the world. We need to understand fully the consequences of the shift from scarcity to abundance, the ways in which these technologies are giving us opportunities to learn and affording us opportunities to learn in ways that simply weren't possible even 5 or 10 years ago. And the amazing part of that, the amazing opportunity that's a piece of that. We need to understand it. And I really do think that intellectually, it's not a difficult case to make that the world is shifting. We see it shifting all around us. We can get it up here. We understand it's changing. But the second piece of it, and I think the hard piece of it, is the emotional part that comes along with that intellectual understanding. And I think this is where our work really has to be. There are a lot of people in education who, when they hear the world is changing, they don't feel excitement about that. They feel anger. They're not happy about this. They've been spending 20, 30 years becoming really good teachers in a system that, defines teaching in a different way. And now we're saying to them, you have to change. You're not a teacher as much as you are now a learner with your kids. You're not a content expert now as much as you are a master learner who models learning on a regular basis for your kids and who asks questions you don't know the answers to, because that's the way they prepare kids for a world of abundance. So we have to deal with that anger, or maybe even that sadness, or maybe even that grief. We have to acknowledge that. We have to feel that. And we have to make sure that we understand that in the context of the intellectual part of that change. Once we get through that, we ourselves have to change. We do have to become learners first. Parents, teachers, community members. My children have great people who are in their learning lives, there's no question. But my children have few models of learners. They see their teachers as teachers. And I think right now they need to see us as learners first. So we have to look at our own practice. We have to figure out, what can we do to model learning in ways that make more sense, that give our kids opportunities to navigate their own spaces in ways that they can fully take advantage of the abundance that they have. And last but certainly not least, then we have to advocate for change in the spaces where the conversations around change are happening. Right now, in my country at least, the voices of educators are fairly silent. They are not a part of that bigger conversation, and they need to be right now. We need to be articulating the idea that schools still have a huge, huge value in our kids' learning lives, but that value has changed. That it is not a place of content so much as it is a place of learning, of inquiry, of collaboration, of critical thinking, of making things with kids that can absolutely change the world and do authentic work in the world, because that is the possibility right now. It's not about simply passing the test. It can no longer be simply about passing the test. It has to be much, much more than that. And I think if we really want to be leaders in education right now, if we really want to lead in terms of advocating for kids, it has to be our job right now to stand up and say, learning is what our kids need to be doing in classrooms, not getting ready for assessments that were built for an age that no longer exists. Thanks very much for your time.